Now, this is LSAT PrepTest 154, Section 3, Passage 4, about international environmental law. Specifically, whether environmental principles actually qualify as customary international law. This is a medium difficulty passage, but the argument itself is pretty straightforward. The problem here is the vocabulary trips you up if you let it. Now, this is a law passage. The author is tearing something down. The main point is that scholars are wrong to treat environmental principles as norms of customary international law. Those principles don't meet the standard, so scholars should focus on treaties instead. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 3. That's where the author reclassifies what these norms really are. Everything before it builds up to that moment. Everything after it follows from that. Now, paragraph 1 is pure setup with no argument yet. It tells you there are no international statutes banning nations from causing environmental damage to each other. So scholars go looking for customary international law, legal principles that are not written in any statute, but show up in how nations actually behave. Then you get 2 examples: the duty to prevent transboundary harm and the precautionary principle. Now, you don't need to memorize the specifics here, just register that there are 2, and they both sound perfectly reasonable. And that reasonableness matters, because the author is going to pull the rug out from you later, and it only works if you bought in here. So you want to move through this at a pretty normal speed. Then paragraph 2 is the setup for the takedown. First, you get the test. How do scholars decide if something counts as a norm of customary international law? Nations have to actually follow the principle, not just talk about it. They have to actually do it. Now watch what happens here. The author says these environmental principles fail that test. Nations don't follow them. Pollutants cross borders constantly, and nations rarely even try to fix it. So by the scholar's own criteria, these principles don't qualify. Now, this is the paragraph where you've got to slow down. The gap between the standard and the reality is doing all the heavy lifting. And if you skim this, paragraph 3 is not going to land. Now, paragraph 3 is where fast readers lose points. And now here's why. You would expect the argument to be done because the principles failed the test, case closed. But the author goes further. Nations don't follow these norms, yet they still claim to support them. And then the author catches the scholars in a contradiction. Scholars say they evaluate norms based on what nations do. But look at their actual debates. They are based on what nations say. That is a totally different thing. Now, here comes the move you can't miss. The author reclassifies these so-called norms. They are not legal standards at all. They are an ideological system, meaning a set of shared ideals that nations use to defend their own behavior and attack other countries. That word ideological is doing massive work. It strips these principles of any legal authority. If you read paragraph 3 and still think the author views these as real legal norms, you're going to get the hardest questions wrong. Now, paragraph 4 is the prescription. It moves fast. Scholars chasing customary international law for environmental cases are wasting their time. Treaties and direct negotiations are how these disputes actually get resolved. So, study that instead. The author even gets specific. Look at how environmental principles can contribute to treaty formation. You want to read this at full speed. There is no surprises here. It's the logical endpoint. Now, the key move is the gap between what nations do and what nations say. The author weaponizes that gap to disqualify these principles as legal norms and reclassify them as ideology. That is what the hardest questions will test. Now, this passage is not about whether environmental protection matters. It's about whether scholars are using the right category to study it. And that is the wrong frame most students fall into here. You read phrases like transboundary harm and precautionary principle, and you start thinking about the environment. But the author doesn't care about the environment here. The author cares about legal classification. If you get pulled into the substance of the principles instead of the argument about their status, you're going to pick wrong answers on main point and attitude questions every single time. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you know these 3 things. First, why do the principles fail the test for customary international law? Second, what does the author think they actually are, if not legal norms? And third, what does the author want scholars to do differently?